Walk into any archive photograph from the Second World War and your eye goes immediately to the uniforms. American soldiers in olive drab, German infantry in feldgrau, British troops in khaki, Soviet forces in their particular shade of earth tone brown. What strikes you, once you start looking carefully, is that none of these colors are accidents. Every shade, every fabric choice, every decision about what a soldier would wear on his body in the most violent conflict in human history was the product of years of argument, experimentation, battlefield observation, and sometimes catastrophic failure. The green and earth tone uniforms of World War II did not emerge fully formed from the minds of designers working in comfortable offices. They were born on battlefields, shaped by dead men, and refined through a process of institutional learning that was often slower and more painful than it needed to be. For most of military history, the color of a soldier's uniform was chosen for reasons that had almost nothing to do with concealment. Bright colors served practical purposes in the era before radio, before reliable long-range communication, before any of the tools that modern commanders use to understand where their forces are on a battlefield. A regiment in bright red or vivid blue could be identified by its own officers from a distance, could be distinguished from the enemy in the smoke and confusion of a musket battle, and could project an image of discipline and power that had genuine psychological value in an era when battles were often decided as much by morale as by firepower. The British redcoat, the Prussian blue, the French white. These were not vanity. They were functional solutions to the problems of command and control in a world where the only way to know where your troops were was to look at them. The problem was that the same industrial revolution that had made those uniforms easier to produce at scale had also dramatically increased the range, accuracy, and rate of fire of the weapons those uniformed soldiers would face. By the time of the American Civil War, rifle technology had advanced to the point where accurate fire was possible, at ranges that made the old assumptions about battlefield visibility actively suicidal. Bright uniforms that announced a soldier's position to every enemy within half a mile were becoming a liability rather than an asset. But the institutional inertia of military tradition moved slowly, and the full reckoning with what modern weapons meant for uniform design was still decades away. The Boer War at the turn of the century was the event that broke the British Army's attachment to the red coat for good. Boer farmers fighting in the South African veldt wore clothing that blended naturally with the earth and scrub around them, and they used that concealment combined with excellent marksmanship to inflict casualties on British forces that stood out against the landscape in colors that might as well have been targets painted on their chests. The British response, driven by battlefield necessity rather than bureaucratic preference, was khaki, a word borrowed from the Urdu for dust or soil-colored. Khaki had already been used in India precisely because British officers serving there had worked out independently that earth tones kept you alive in terrain where concealment mattered. The Boer War nationalized that lesson across the entire British Army. Other European powers were watching and drawing their own conclusions. The German Army, which had gone to war in 1870 wearing a dark Prussian blue that showed up clearly against most natural backgrounds, spent the following decades arguing internally about the right color for a modern military uniform. The debate was genuinely contested. Conservative officers who understood the importance of unit identification in battle argued for colors that remained visible. Progressive officers who understood what modern rifles and machine guns did to men who could be seen argued for something else entirely. The progressive view won, and feldgrau, field gray, became the color of the German army by the time of the First World War. The name is more descriptive than poetic. It meant simply the color of a field. The First World War accelerated every lesson about uniform design that previous conflicts had begun to teach. Artillery, which by 1916 was delivering shell fire in volumes that would have seemed inconceivable to any previous generation of soldiers, made the idea of a brightly colored uniform seem almost comic in its irrelevance. Men were dying from shells they never saw coming, from machine gun fire that swept entire fields of advance before any individual soldier came close enough to the enemy line for his uniform color to matter to anyone. The dominant colors of the First World War's surviving photographs are the colors of mud and earth and damaged landscape. And the men who fought in them were already dressed, in most armies, in colors chosen to blend with exactly that environment. The American Army entered the Second World War with a uniform story that was complicated, contested, and in some respects genuinely impressive. The olive drab color that would come to define the American soldier's visual identity across the entire war was not a single precise shade, but a family of related earth tones that varied between manufacturers, between production runs, and between the different garments that made up a complete uniform. Olive drab had been adopted by the American Army in the years before the First World War, replacing the dark blue that had been the Army's color since the Civil War. And its selection had been driven by exactly the same logic that was pushing every other major military toward earth tones. It was harder to see against natural backgrounds than bright colors. It showed less dirt than lighter shades, and it didn't fade to a color that was worse than what it started as. The specific olive drab of American World War II uniforms was chosen through a process of testing and compromise that involved the Army's Quartermaster Corps, which was responsible for clothing and equipping soldiers, and input from officers who had studied the terrain in which American forces were likely to fight. The challenge was that the United States, unlike Germany or Britain, was going to fight in an enormous variety of terrain types across multiple continents and climate zones. A color that worked perfectly in the forests and fields of northwestern Europe might be conspicuous in the deserts of North Africa, and a shade optimized for Mediterranean terrain might stand out badly in the jungles of the Pacific. The decision to maintain a single primary uniform color for most American forces across all theaters was a logistical choice as much as a tactical one. A recognition that producing and distributing multiple theater-specific uniform systems was beyond the practical capability of the supply chain. The olive drab solution was, in practice, a reasonable compromise that worked better in some environments than others. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, where the landscape was a dense patchwork of green fields and dark earth, American olive drab provided genuine concealment value. In the North African desert, where American forces fought their first major campaigns of the war, the same color provided rather less. American soldiers in Tunisia discovered that German forces wearing their own version of earth tone uniform blended into the desert landscape more effectively than olive drab did. And this observation contributed to the development of theater-specific clothing for desert operations. The lesson, repeated in different forms across different theaters, was that no single color solved every concealment problem, but that muted earth tones were consistently less dangerous than anything brighter. The German uniform story of the Second World War is in many ways more sophisticated than the American one, partly because Germany had been thinking carefully about field uniform design for longer, and partly because the Wehrmacht's experience in early campaigns gave its quartermaster system rapid and detailed feedback about what was and wasn't working. Feldgrau remained the base color, but German uniform design evolved significantly during the war in response to conditions encountered in specific theaters. The Africa Corps developed a distinctive tropical uniform in a warm tan color that provided better concealment in desert conditions than standard Feldgrau would have. And photographs of Rommel's forces in North Africa show a careful attention to matching clothing to environment that reflected genuine institutional learning. The Eastern Front produced the most dramatic evolution in German uniform design, driven by conditions that existing uniform systems were simply not designed for. The Russian winter, which stopped the German advance in 1941 and killed soldiers at rates that horrified the high command, demonstrated that the standard Feldgrau uniform was wholly inadequate for temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero, in conditions that offered no shelter and demanded continuous physical activity. The German Army's response evolved through a combination of improvisation and increasingly sophisticated issue equipment, eventually including reversible winter suits that were white on one side for use in snow and Feldgrau, or camouflage on the other for use when snow cover was incomplete. The white winter uniform was not just about concealment, though concealment in a snow-covered landscape against an enemy who knew how to use terrain was genuinely critical. It was also about the psychological reality that a soldier who felt equipped for his environment fought differently than one who felt exposed to conditions his equipment had not anticipated. The Waffen-SS, the military arm of the SS organization, developed camouflage uniform patterns during the war that were ahead of anything the regular Wehrmacht or the Allied armies were fielding at the same time. The distinctive oak leaf, plane tree, and later patterns that SS units wore represented a genuine conceptual advance in uniform design, moving beyond a single muted color toward a printed pattern of multiple colors designed to break up the human outline against natural backgrounds. These patterns worked on a principle that military uniform designers had been circling for decades but had not yet fully committed to: that the eye identifies objects partly by their overall color and partly by their outline, and that disrupting the outline through a multicolor pattern could provide concealment even when the overall color was not a perfect match for the immediate environment. An SS soldier in an oak leaf camouflage smock standing in a mixed light and shadow forest environment was significantly harder to identify at distance than a soldier in any solid color uniform, even a well-chosen one. The British Army of the Second World War wore khaki that had evolved considerably from the simple dust color of the Boer War era. British battle dress, the wool uniform that became standard through most of the war, was a practical garment that represented decades of experience with what soldiers needed a uniform to do. It was warm enough for Northern European temperatures, durable enough for extended field use, and cut in a way that allowed reasonable freedom of movement without the excess fabric that created snagging hazards in dense terrain. The color, a brownish khaki that read as earth tone in most European environments, was not dramatically different from American olive drab or German Feldgrau in terms of its basic concealment value, but the British had also developed specific camouflage patterns for airborne and special forces that recognized the need for more sophisticated concealment in operations where detection was immediately fatal. The color green, across all these uniform systems, was doing something beyond simple camouflage that is easy to overlook when you focus only on the tactical logic. Green and earth tone colors communicated something about the purpose of the uniform and the identity of the man wearing it that bright colors could not. A soldier in olive drab or Feldgrau was visually integrated into the landscape rather than standing apart from it. The uniform announced, through its color, that its wearer was part of the environment he was operating in, that he belonged to the ground rather than being a visitor moving across it. This is not a trivial psychological point. The identity that a uniform creates is part of how armies build the cohesion and the sense of shared purpose that makes a collection of individuals into a fighting force. The earth tone uniform of the Second World War said something specific. This soldier is serious, practical, built for the work of war rather than the display of it. The factories that produced these uniforms were operating at a scale that would have been incomprehensible to any previous generation of military logisticians. The United States alone manufactured hundreds of millions of individual uniform items during the Second World War. Produced through a combination of existing textile industry capacity converted to military use and new facilities built specifically for the purpose. The dye chemistry required to produce consistent olive drab at that scale across hundreds of different manufacturers and thousands of production runs was a genuine industrial challenge. And the fact that American uniforms from the war show some variation in color from garment to garment and batch to batch reflects the difficulty of maintaining consistency when you are producing fabric in quantities that no peacetime civilian market had ever demanded. The green and earth tone uniforms of the Second World War were, in the end, the product of a complete rethinking of what a soldier's clothing was for. They were tools, not symbols. They were designed around the requirements of the body wearing them and the environment that body was moving through, rather than around the requirements of parade grounds and peacetime ceremony. The shift from bright colors to earth tones that had begun at the Boer War and accelerated through the First World War reached its mature expression in the uniforms of the Second World War. And the soldiers who wore those uniforms understood, at a practical level that needed no explanation, what the color meant. It meant that someone had thought seriously about keeping them alive. It meant that the clothing on their backs was part of the same serious business as the weapon in their hands, and it meant, in the most literal possible sense, that they were dressed for the world they were actually living in, rather than the world someone thought soldiers ought to inhabit. The green was never just a color. It was a philosophy, paid for in blood across a generation of learning. and worn every day by the men who needed it most.